So I talked about some of the general skills, someone who's curious and thorough and strategic and able to prioritize. But make no mistake, SEO is a hands-on job. It's one that requires very specific skills. So I'm going to walk you through some of those that I've looked for in the team that I have and what I challenge them on a regular basis to continue to improve. So the first is just general knowledge of SEO tenets and best practice, much of which we'll be teaching you about during this course. Things related to how keyword research can be done, or how content can be laid out in the best way, or how a website can be navigated in the most important way or the most specific way that Google's asking for. But it also requires somebody who has taken the time and gained the experience, perhaps just from their own website, of how things like 404 errors or 301 redirects or Google Webmaster Tools or Google Search Console, it's now called, how those types of platforms and practices can be used to drive forward a strategy, and knowing when to push forward a content strategy versus something that's more technical in nature. Someone also who has good knowledge of content marketing. What is good content? Why does it appeal to a user to take action, to convert on that button, or take the trial, or download the white paper, or choose the e-commerce path that you have intended for them on that website? So someone who thinks strategically about SEO but also content marketing, I think is critical. The second, especially for those that are thinking about SEO in a global nature, is someone who has an understanding of language. Doesn't mean you necessarily need to be bilingual or trilingual, but it means you're curious about language. You understand that there's a difference between localization, where something is written in and pertinent to someone in that country, versus translation, where translation is simply taking the copy and putting it into the easiest form of writing, but it may not be relevant to someone who's a native speaker. So localization processes and best practices are also a key tenet of someone in a global capacity. This includes how the workflow of localization happens, how the review occurs, and the quality assurance process to ensure that localization is done well. The third hands-on skill, I would say, is someone who has basic web architecture and knowledge of how the internet works. Most likely this has come from personal experience, where you just love the web, you love to consume, you're curious about how people navigate and find content, but you also understand, as I mentioned before, how perhaps a search keyword might translate to a search result, and then how the search engines might display the content that's being shown. It means you have curiosity about how redirects, a 301 redirect, and how is that different than a 302 redirect, and why do they matter? That's something that we'll actually teach you about in this course. It means you're able to understand some of the data you get from analytics, the analytics packages that are out there, like in Google Analytics or in the Google Search Console. And that when you get reports on errors that are occurring on the website, you're able to take those errors and say, this is what it means. I can interpret this as a human. I can apply this to a stakeholder that needs to go make this change, and it will help the search robots navigate our website better. So that's also a critical skill. The next one that I talked about earlier in a day in the life is someone who has a mindset to be data-driven. We call it data-driven marketing because you need to have the familiarity with the reporting and tracking tools, but also the capacity and the passion to think about reporting, that you're not afraid of data, you're not unwilling to look deeply into what that data is telling you about the search performance. So you might have gained experience through some of the free platforms out there. Google Analytics is the most common one, that you are looking at the numbers and the pathways and the different keywords and the different search experiences that people have and how that translates down into the numbers that you see in those platforms. It really also means someone who has developed some proven experience developing a successful SEO plan and strategy, and they've used data-driven reporting to gain credibility and drive forward that strategy. And the last hands-on skill I would say is someone who gains experience with platforms and tools, because this is a discipline, SEO, where you do need to have experience in these hands-on platforms. The two most common that I've mentioned already is one is called the Google Search Console, and the other is called Bing Webmaster Tools. And anybody with a login ID and access to a website can have access to these two tools. And it benefits anyone to go and learn and be curious about what kind of data they see out of those. The other I've mentioned is Google Analytics, which you can use with any website. There's also CMS systems, content management systems, where you can learn about how sites can be developed. WordPress is the most common that a lot of people use, but in an in-house role, there are enterprise CMS platforms that are much more common. Then there's also a lot of tools. There's many off-the-shelf tools. There's browser plugins that will navigate a website and report back to you what is important about that site and different errors and opportunities to improve. And we'll share with you during this course some of the tools and plugins that you might want to make use of. And the last I would say is somebody who's comfortable with the Microsoft Office suite of tools, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, or the versions of those in the organization you might work for. Because you do spend a lot of time not only writing, but communicating through data and reports and putting those reports into a PowerPoint deck that can be shared with a stakeholder group in a monthly or quarterly format. So some of what I've talked about in terms of skills and knowledge and tools is covered in this course, but some of the skills are taught in the more advanced SEO courses. I wanted to give you an overview so you know really what to expect in a career in SEO.